Lucy and Lysoon for inviting me and for allowing me to speak about my ideas and my work and what I do and how I do it and why I do it. The title of the show, Consumed by the Gospel of Uncertainty, I think it describes very well where the sources of my work come from, which is like I sometimes don't know what's going to happen. My work is also very much influenced by my not religious background, but when you grow up in Italy and Mexico, religion is a big part of your life. So I grew up knowing about the Bible even without reading the whole thing. So, and I also feel that my work, as I was speaking yesterday, oscillates between a very comfortable place where I know what's going to happen and how things work, and then another place where there's a lot of risk and I am very anxious about opening the kiln. And I just don't know what's going to happen, then if things are going to disintegrate in my hands or if it's even going to work out and show the intention behind it. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I thought that that would be a very good word to describe what is going on here. But I'm going to start by saying that I am very attractive to what I cannot understand. And the more mysterious and the more difficult it is to decipher, the more I run towards it. And I have a love relationship with it because it also creates a lot of anxiety for me, and I would like to be more stable in what I make and knowing where it's going. But in another hand, I just want to try the whole spectrum of things, and I want to keep exploring what it is, the material and the vocabulary of the material and what I can say and what I can push it to do. So I work primarily with clay and clay sculpture and the ceramic processes, and that has always been my passion. Both my parents are archaeologists, so I've been in close contact with ceramics and old ceramics since I was a kid. I was born in Mexico. My father is Italian, and my mother is Mexican. My mother is half native Mexican and half Spanish, and my father comes from the south of Italy, so we have a lot of Albanian blood. My cousin was just here, so we were just talking about that tradition and how Albanian people are considered ruthless people because they move a lot. So I thought that made a lot of sense in a very primordial, raw way. So I was raised in Mexico, but also in Italy, and we traveled a lot, and we interacted with both cultures and both language all the time. And language in my life plays a very big part because right now you see me speaking English, but I also speak Spanish with my parents and Italian, and it just all mashes up, and sometimes I combine the words, and sometimes I feel like my sculpture is like these tubes that just connect to each other and you cannot really decipher what's happening. But even with this like language ability that I've had since I was a kid, my husband Craig still says that he needs to translate for me because sometimes people look at me like they didn't understand what I said. So he feels like he has to translate from Renata to English, and I always thought that was funny. So I wanted to start with this slide. This is the piece that I finished as I was coming to Boston. This is terracotta, and it's all hand built. The tubes underneath are extruded and then manipulated. And the way that I want this slideshow to work is I'm going to show you pieces, and I'm also going to show you the sources of those pieces, and we'll talk about the process and how the process of building and how the process of making works for me. I've always been very clear about I think through making. So a lot of the decisions I make happen when I am making the piece and how the material is responding to me and what I am looking in it and what is happening as I am making it. So for a while now, I've been very interested in the Xipetotec, which is a Mexican deity, an Aztec deity, and it's the god of transformation. and liberation, and life, death, and rebirth. And he's also called our Lord the Flayed One because he's usually represented without his skin, or he would wear the skin of another warrior. And so, and similar to, when the Aztecs thought that this was similar to corn. Whenever you eat corn, you take the skin off of it. So they thought that it was, even though it's a very, you could say, very gory image of someone that doesn't have skin, for them it represented rebirth and transition. And I feel that there's a lot happening in our lives, even though we don't really think about it. There's a lot of transition happening constantly under our feet. And I've always been very interested in that. So here you can see one image of Xipetotec's head, which you probably can see there, just upside down. And the bottom of it is inspired in these pieces, which I saw in a church not too long ago in December in the city of Puebla in Mexico. And these are saints that are being burned by the flames of hell. So you can see formally where these elements are coming from. And yeah, as I said, I am very much inspired by my two countries, Mexico and Italy, by religion, by colonialism, by Catholicism. And what you're going to see in these slides is really what inspires my work, and how my surroundings and what I read and what I listen to are seeping into it. If you have questions, you can also interrupt me. I really like that dialogue, so you can just tell me. This is the first iteration of Xipetotec. A lot of my pieces have previous lives where I tried it once, it really didn't work, or something worked, or it really worked, but I just left it there, and years later I come back to it. And this one I made 2 years ago. It's just the skin of Xipetotec's face, and you can see his tongue has been ripped out, and it's transitioning into a new tongue. So it's sort of like growing, like there you can see how it's growing. And this is the back of it. And I was really experimenting with feldspar and what feldspar could do. And now it's very popular to use feldspar in this way, and how it oozes and it creates this sort of textures that look like bubble gum, but they also look like something fleshy, something that is alive. And I like to keep that aspect in my sculptures, that aspect of something that it's in constant growth and it's constantly changing. These are the kind of structures that are comforting for me, this monolithic and mysterious. As I said, both my parents are archaeologists, so I grew up going to places like this, and my parents would spend hours talking to people, and me and my sister would spend those hours just running around and looking at old structures and sort of thinking about what they were about. My parents would tell you that archaeologists are really just making things up, and they don't know for certain what they're talking about, but yeah.
Where is that?
This is in Mitla, in Oaxaca. Yes, it's this is a one-of-a-kind archaeological site because of the decoration here on top of the building. Like, this does not happen in any other archaeological site in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I think also what I find comforting from these structures is how they're rooted in time and labor. And I really want for my work to communicate that. I want to imprint these concepts in my work: time, gesture, and labor. So here, this is an old Olmec head. This was in the 1920s. This is a picture from the 1920s when they first dug out this massive stone piece, very monolithic, very mysterious, very impenetrable. And when I had just finished art school in Mexico, I got a job as a restorer in the archaeological side, and I thought it was very interesting that this very head was my first assignment. I had to clean it with a toothbrush. And here it is.
Wow.
So those connections are important to me, and I don't really recognize those connections until time has passed and I look back and I think like, oh, that happened. And that just fascinates me, how these things happen and we don't understand them. And how these solid, impenetrable, undecipherable things are so, they're just so attractive. I don't know how they're unknown and powerful. And I think more and more that's what I'm striving for. Things that are impenetrable, yet they're calling at you. And this is a sculpture that I made in China 2 years ago, and it's inspired in that piece. This one I called El Señor del Mictlán, which is the god of the kingdom of dead in Mexico, in Aztec culture. And this piece was actually exhibited here a year ago.
And we sold it.
Yeah.
You told me.
So, as I said, I was very fortunate and privileged to grow up with parents that work and manipulate history. And both as archaeologists, they hold learning and seeking and curiosity and questioning as the most important part of life. So that's how I was brought up. And I think this image really talks about where I come from. And on the left, you can see the sunstone, which is also called the Aztec calendar. It's a massive, massive circular stone. And on the other side, you can see the Mouth of Truth, which is set in Rome. And I think there's a movie where the protagonist, maybe it's Audrey Hepburn, puts her hand in there, and it's very flirty, and so that you might remember it for that movie. But so I spent countless holidays and vacations amongst ruins and burial sites and looking at these old things, and at the moment not very aware of the effect that these artifacts and these structures were going to have in my life. And looking back, I now understand why I'm so invested in circles. Like, circles just keep happening. Like, these cyclical forms just keep coming at me. This piece I made in 2017. And I wanted to show this one because I think this is also the beginning of the circles. I made this piece in 2010 when I had just first started working at Gustavo Perez studio, and I had to throw all of my pieces, and I was wondering how I could push that into another space that wasn't just a thrown vessel. Because in that studio, Gustavo's work is very, very powerful. It holds a lot of weight, and that's what you do when you work for him. You make his work. And I just wanted to push away from that tradition, of the throne and altered vessel, and I wanted to make it something of my own. And this is when I first started not only experimenting with form and cutting form and stacking it together, but I also started experimenting with glaze and how glaze can be another structural and formal element in the piece. And yeah, I just keep looking back at circles. This is De La Robia, and it's a Majolica large circular wall piece. And this is a piece that I made during grad school that doesn't exist anymore, but I've always thought of it of maybe one of my best pieces, actually. And how it sits in this metal pedestal, how half of it or a little bit of it is coming from the bottom, and how it looks like it's falling apart, but it's also holding together. I call it Time Begins because it's made of 3 pieces that just sit very precariously together. And it feels like if you touch it, it's gonna fall apart, but it's still stable and holds time. And there is an obvious cyclical meaning to these circles, to these wheels, but they're also like a transient nature. There's an Asian mysticism that I want to imprint into these pieces. What you see here in the picture is a work in progress. What I'm working towards now is a different glaze sculpture. It's more of a sheet of glaze that holds by itself. and this is my first experiment of it. It's hard. It's very frustrating to make this kind of work because it breaks all the time. And for me, for it to be successful, it should come out in one piece. And this is what has been consuming a lot of my days in the studio, is figuring out how to get this thing out in one piece. And I think that's part of my practice, is to focus all of this labor and frustrate all of these feelings, contradicting feelings about making work, and to put them into the work itself.
I think the cracks are interesting. If not what you want.
Yeah, but it's I just have to work through it. Like, we can have a conversation about how I need to work through these frustrations. And what I tell my students, and that I need to listen to myself too, is that frustrations is something that you manage, not that you surrender to. So I'm always constantly working on not surrendering to this and just managing it so that I can work through it. And I think yesterday people were asking me about this glaze work that I make, this glaze casting, and really the most simple explanation is that it started because when I came to this country, I started speaking English all the time, and I could feel myself changing into someone that I didn't know. And I could also see my physicality changing into something that I didn't know and I was getting acquainted with. And I wanted to see if I could communicate that through material, to actually change the nature of the material and make it go through what I felt I was and I'm still going through, which is this very fundamental change. So I started thinking about, could I make the glaze the piece itself, to cast the glaze and to come out with a piece that it's just glaze. Could I do that? And I started investigating if I could just release the glaze from the mold. I usually make a clay mold, line it with alumina, and the alumina oxide, for those that don't know, doesn't melt. It melts at a very high temperature. So if you apply that, line your mold with that, and then pour the glaze in, it won't let the glaze stick to the clay, which would then make it release from this mold. And I found that some glazes can do that and some glazes can't. They eat through this layer and then they stick to the clay. So I thought, then why would I need for it to release? I can just cut it out. And I started experimenting with concrete sauce, very large diamond blades. And then the glaze became this material that it wasn't this nice glass layer on top of clay, but it became this massive stone that I had to carve and cut in a way like if I was making a marble sculpture. So I started experimenting with that, and you can see that piece right there, which is this piece right here I call it cascajo, which means rubble in Spanish. And this was one of my first pieces that I took the saw to and started cutting it and carving it into something different. And then this glaze, what I thought through making it is that it started feeling like a piece that fell off the wall. A lot of these pieces that are cut, and all of this glaze that is cut, it starts feeling like something that fell off the wall, and now it used to be a part of something and now it's not. And
Renata, do you still have the first iteration of that?
Megumi has it.
I do.
Yeah, this piece was vertical at one time.
Yeah, but this was before I cut it. Like, this changes a lot. And this is what I was talking about thinking through making, because I may take something out of the kiln and it doesn't work. Like that first version of that, it wasn't really working for me. And then I just do something else to it, or I break it and cast it again. Like, there's a lot of cannibalism in my work. If a piece spends too much time in my studio, at some point I'm just gonna take a hammer and break it and put it into something else.
Okay, so.
Okay.
I want to go back to what your parents taught you
Yes.
about geology. What was the,
Archaeology?
our archaeology is made up, mostly made up. What was their,
Well, they think that archaeology is an interpretation, really, of findings.
all right, from there, you spent a lot of time recycling pieces.
Yes.
And you still do?
Yes.
So my question is more around how fixed or unfixed history is. If your work is, you know, your body of work, I mean, is everything still in your mind potentially recyclable and not fixed? Or have you grown accustomed
To finishing things?
Yeah.
As I said, if it spends too much time in my studio, it needs to leave. I think it needs to leave, it needs to go somewhere else, it needs to come to a gallery, it needs to go to someone. Because if it stays too long, at some point I am going to change, and I am not, this work is not changing with me, so I'm gonna have to break it apart and construct it again so it moves with me. So if I give, it's like when I give away a piece, it's like I'm giving away the snapshot of that time. And then if the piece stays with me, then this piece is gonna have to change, because I am constantly transforming in my ideas and in my practice as well. I feel like this is a constant growth, and the pieces have to grow with me. And it's also a constant back and forward, because right now I'm finding a lot of comfort in hand building and building these larger pieces, which has a lot to do with what I used to do with Mina, for example. That we built large sculpture ceramic pieces that were all hand built. And I'm finding a lot of comfort in coming to the studio every day and having this thing that I can see grow and change constantly. All right. It's good. I like that. I like the questions. I think added a dialogue that I like, instead of me just talking about the pictures.
Renata, quick question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Again. You said you were using a lot of terracotta on
Yeah.
the newer pieces, especially from the Mixtec gods,
Yes.
and the Aztec gods. Are you using that in reference to the tradition of Mexican pottery, or is it because it's easier to build with?
The terracotta.
Yes.
There is a link to, yes, to using a material that is used in the Mexican crafts,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also a material that, to me, it shows a lot of warmth and a lot of depth,
Okay.
especially in surface treatment. So I think when you scratch and when you use, it's like painters like to put darker colors. Some
Mhm.
painters, not all, not generalizing for the camera, to put darker colors in their canvas before they start working the surface, because that adds a lot of depth.
Mhm.
And I feel, in formally speaking, for me, terracotta adds that to the work. But yes, I mean, conceptually, the material does link to that side. And also to Italian amphoras
Oh, absolutely.
and majolica and all, because I use a lot of majolica glazes that I manipulate in my low fire work. So, as I was saying, I see these pieces as pieces of something else, as rubble, and you can see the direct inspiration that I find in things that fall apart and fall down and are very raw and used to be part of something and are not anymore. And yeah, it's a risk. It's a risk to make this work, but I cannot stop myself from that, from breaking the rules and using different firing temperatures with the same piece. Like this piece was fired to cone 11, and then I took it to cone 6, and then I took it to cone 4, and then I used castable in the bottom, castable is the thing that you put on top of wood kilns. It's like fireable cement, and this is thanks to Jim, because we were experimenting with that for a kiln in school, and I was like, oh, I wonder if I could build something out of this. And I've always find that very interesting, to go and to find a material that you would usually use and use it. I mix plaster in glaze, I mix cement in glaze, and I just want to see what happens. And really that's what's driving this whole experimentation, is I just want to see what happens, and sometimes really magical things come out. Here you can see a detail of the top of that piece. It's really, there's a lot happening, and you cannot really tell a lot of details from it, and that's really what attracts me to this kind of work. It's really what's going on in the middle of these pieces. It's just put everything in there, and how do you say that, kitchen sink? So here you can appreciate more of what I'm talking about when I say glaze as structure. And they start looking at core samples of, you dig out, take a core sample of something. So these pieces, this is also, I think, 1 year ago that I made this. When I was at Kent State, I was a resident artist there. And here I started experimenting with pouring the glaze. I make a clay box, pouring the glaze and then tilting it a little bit and letting the glaze dry that way, and then pouring another glaze and tilting it and drying. So I create these patterns. Here you can see very clearly, like that pattern here, and this pattern here, and this pattern here. And it's really just trying different things and getting a sample of this transformation that is happening inside the kiln. This one piece you can see back there in the window. And sometimes I get inspired by what I have around me, so I take kiln furniture and use bricks and use kiln furniture also to build structures inside these glaze cats. And the more they start cracking and the more they start looking like they're gonna fall apart, the more I like them. So here you can see the inspiration. I thought that this could be a bust, one of those busts, Roman busts that you see at the Met that have missing pieces, but you can still tell what it used to be. And this piece I really like, and I keep going back to it because I think it shows a lot of what I'm after. And this group of smaller pieces is called banderas, which means flags. And curiously, the Mexican flag and the Italian flag have both the same colors in the same order. And when I made them, they were used to be square, and then I took a saw to them and started cutting them in different parts. So they started looking more like buildings. If you look at them, they're like far away buildings that are falling apart, but the inside of them is regenerating. And a lot of questions started arising from this work. And I started thinking a lot about, I told you that literature is also a very big influence in my work, so I started thinking about James Baldwin when he said that we cannot escape our origins, however hard we try, those origins which contain the key, could we but find it to all we later become. And yeah, I think about every day how where I come from really shapes how I think and how I speak and what I think about. And I also think about something that my dad said recently. He's turning 70 in a month. And he was talking about how he thinks that memory is like an onion. So when we grow, we start putting layers into this onion. And now when we get older, we start peeling it out so we get to the core. And he thinks that at the moment of his death, he's going to remember his birth. Because he keeps remembering more and more and more of when he was a kid. So he's always thinking about, yeah, maybe when I die, I'm going to remember when I was born. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I can see that in my father now, how he's mixing a lot of more Italian words when he speaks, and he didn't used to do that, and that's very unconscious. So unconsciously, he's really going back to where he started. Unconsciously, I can see him really going back to who he was before he emigrated to Mexico 40 years ago. And that, yeah, that's just very interesting to me. And that's something that I think about when I make my work too. You can see here detail of this piece, and there's also a very technically and in a more geeky way, there's something very interesting because these two glazes are the same, just this glaze is as it is, and to this glaze I added a red stain, and this happened to it. So you can see the difference between these two glazes, and those things also I'm very curious about. How does things work? Why did adding that stain to that glaze now makes it look like it's a bone while the other one looks like it's a stone? And yeah, as I said, I think about a lot how where we come from shapes who we are and how we think and where we go and what we're attracted to. I grew up around ruins, not only archaeological ruins, but some parts of Mexico feel like they're falling apart. And I found artifacts and restored remains and things that are fixed over and over again. Those things, rugged landscapes, thorny vegetation, all of those things really impact the way I see ceramics. And here you can see a little bit of the influence of those things. This piece that it's inspired by this labyrinth of cactuses, but it's also inspired by Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean writer, who wrote that we're like detectives who are lost in a labyrinth of glaze and clay. And I was like, that is perfect, because that's exactly what it is. Detectives lost in a labyrinth of glass and clay. And here you can see the other side of it. This piece, this head is full of feldspar with stain. So you can see the inside really looks like it's like bodily. The whole thing is very bodily. And these pieces, these sort of tiles, are a cast. Then I'm talking about the cannibalism. This is a cast that I cut. And then I was like, I'm not really into this. And then I arranged them together and made a larger cast. So this piece is like 2.5 feet diameter. Vegetation, and especially Mexican vegetation, really influences a lot of my surfaces, even though it really doesn't show. And yeah, I am always looking for the past and the present, and I spend a lot of time looking for those clues of past structures in urban spaces. This is one of summers ago in Rome. It's the Trevi Fountain. And I think also about how Fellini talked about how all art, the main intention between all art is autobiographical. And I think in many ways, at least in my work, it is. I'm not really trying to, in the beginning, I wasn't really trying to talk about myself, and then I was, and now I am trying to just let that come out naturally without forcing too much of my identity. It's gonna come out anyway, it's my work, so my identity is gonna come out from it. This is a scene from Fellini's Rome. So surreal and decadent and sublime, and right now I'm trying to think about how that word sublime fits into what I make, because decadent I know where it fits. And yeah, this restored things, restored objects, restored bones. My work, it feels a lot like I have to restore it all the time. It's my favorite room at the Met. And and this adding these industrial materials to complete this form, it's also very, very interesting to me. And you can see how this seeps into the work. And also the bodily, it's like finding an animal dead on the road, and you cannot really tell what it used to be. You cannot really tell because it's like inside out, and its guts are out and the skin is in, and you cannot really tell where the legs used to be. Yeah, those images, I look at them and I'm curious, and then I look at my work and I see where all of that is going. It's an image of Mexico City. It's where I grew up. And an image of Oaxaca, where I've spent a lot of time. And I'm going somewhere with these images. I'm going here. The loops and the tubes and all of this started appearing because I wanted a physical way to show how much of these connections are happening inside of us without us knowing. And I wanted it to be like an X-ray of all of these connections, not only conceptual and emotional and physical connections are happening inside of us. So a lot of these colors and a lot of these shapes, you see like all of this mess here, so all of that is what inspires a lot of the formal decisions in my work too. And this mixing materials together, I am really interested in concrete too. In concrete also in these urban areas where it feels like they made a sculpture out of it. And you can see how it comes into my work. Like all of this is concrete that I cast into cardboard boxes. It's very low tech. But here you can see the inspiration. This image is in Mexico on the tops of the walls. Instead of having metal or another fence or something to protect from people jumping on the wall, they break glass and then they insert it into the wall. So I thought that I could do that with glaze too, and I started experimenting with that. This is a church in Puebla that I found beautiful, and this is a temple, a Buddhist temple, and this is a bird that I found, and all of these images I think are connected through a spirituality and a religious feeling, and that really inspires this piece. For example, the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is over there. It's like this holiness and this golden idea is escaping from this structure. It's trying to catch it with these things. But it also seeps into here. This piece was inspired by images of saints and halos, things that I really cannot understand. But as I said, the more I cannot understand it, the more I like it, the more I run towards it. And I thought when this piece came out, it looked like a mountain, but it also looked like the head of an animal that had a halo behind it. This is the Day of the Dead in Mexico, and it really inspired the way I installed this piece, which I called The Celebration. These pieces I made in China in 2018, and I had 2 months to be there, and China was really a transformative time because it was very challenging in terms of communicating, very challenging in terms of being there for 2 months without fully understanding what was going on. And these pieces were what came out from that time. And I arranged them all in this long table in the middle of the space, with these pieces over here that I saw like animal heads. It was that whole setting of being at a party and these animal heads on the wall and all of these little beings, these little creatures hanging out on the table.
With casters.
Yes, I love wheels because then you can move. You can roll around. They're mobile. They can go wherever they want. Because I've always seen them like beings, like things that are alive. So if I give them wheels, then they also have the possibility to move at will. Will. So I'm not immune about what happens in my country. I know what is happening. I go there 3 times a year. I'm very much in touch with that, and that really sometimes comes into my work. Even though I don't openly talk about it, I do. It's something that is part of my life, and I don't make work about advocacy, or I don't make work about awareness. I think that I've decided that my work is not the way that I communicate that, and I do that through other means. I volunteer. I am a medical interpreter, so that is the way that I have an outlet for that desire to help people. So, but that does sometimes seep into my work. This is an image from the north border of Mexico, which is the south border of the US. This doesn't happen every day, but it does happen, and we do see it in the news, and it's something that we live with every day. So I make sometimes work about carrying all of these things with me. And you can see the use of concrete and the use of other materials. There's plaster in there too. There's gold leaf. It's just mixed media. And I started calling these pieces, what's the word in English? Not collages, but what Robert Rauschenberg used to do? Assemblage. Yes,
Assemblage.
that. I've started calling them assemblage because going again to the cannibalism, these are just pieces of other pieces, and they're really not pieces, they're charts. And I just put them together, and this is the back side of it. And I started also using paint to finish them. It's really a lot of what I shouldn't do, and then I do it.
Renata, I'm curious to hear you talk about what that process has been like for you in terms of letting yourself do that, giving yourself permission to do that. Like, I mean, in my experience, that's something that just is an ongoing.
Yes.
You kind of keep opening doors. And how has that been for you? Like, in terms of maybe breakthroughs that you've had with the work to try something that just you were like, oh, I could never try that.
I think it has to be the right day, because as I said, I go like back and forward. Some days I'm very much into making traditional, like in a more comfortable, I know what's gonna happen way. And in other days I have the stamina to be like, I'm gonna try it today, and I'm going to put this thing inside the kiln, or I'm going to break this piece. I'm going to take the hammer to it and break it and just put it somewhere else. I think it really has to be the right day for it to take the risk. But it is a thing that has been growing. And also, I mean, I couldn't do it without, for example, the support of an institution, like, because a lot of these experiments, firing sometimes take 4 days, or I need a bigger kiln. Like, if I had my own studio, I think my experimentation would go in a much slower pace. And I'm also very fortunate that I have students that are really curious about it too, and they're willing to help. So a lot of that really has helped to the fast pace of this experimentation. I have to give that credit. But I think making this kind of work has been hard because one, I'm calculating, I want to say 70% of the time it doesn't work, and what you see is that 30% that over 2 years did work. And that's a big loss margin. And it's also it's expensive because it's a lot of time. I was talking to my husband yesterday, and I was telling him that just now I am finishing pieces that I started in August last year. It takes a long time. you have to wait for things to dry, you have to wait for the right tool, you have to wait for the right day. Yeah. And also pieces, sometimes I don't know how I'm gonna finish something, and I have to wait until that right time comes. And that's why I have so many things started and going on. And yeah, and one piece fits the other one or informs the other one. It's a long process, and I think that's where the labor imprint comes in. But maybe you don't see that labor though in a lot of the pieces. What you see is the final result. Yeah.
It's very clear that this work is so much about labor.
Yeah, it is.
It speaks really strongly.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Intentionality behind the work. So you can see also the inspiration for this one. And when I first started working with the glaze idea, I was thinking about how it engulfs, how it just takes over things. This is an old church in the south of Mexico, and it's in a dam. And this is the inspiration for that piece. And you guys have that piece in your house.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. That one was also a risk because this thing is only sitting on these posts. And these posts were gonna fall apart at any time. And this piece actually broke, so I had a lot of this blue glaze on the kiln. So, and that's also, I spend a lot of time cleaning kilns. Which labor again.
I guess this is a technical question, but how do
Yeah.
you go about cutting pieces? Like, are you hand sawing them, or do you?
I take a concrete saw. So it's a big 14-inch diamond blade. And before I used to rent them because I didn't have the money, and now I just got a grant to buy one. So now I have my own. They're like 20 pounds, and you just go in and cut the glaze. The glaze becomes stone, and it's like concrete is actually softer. So I'm assuming concrete is easier to cut, but the glaze becomes stone and glass, and you have all of this charts going out, and a lot of the times they crack. So if you look at the glaze cats, they all have cracks, like hairline cracks, because it's a lot of violence that goes into cutting them. And this is another example of how accumulation really informs my surfaces. And I saw this thing in China, and I was very interested in this tar that somebody just put there, and it started dripping and accumulating, and this texture really called to me, and I wanted to replicate it. And then I started making this experiment with low fire clay and low fire slip, and just with one of those squeeze bottles, like the ketchup bottles, I just started squeezing slip, and every day I would come and squeeze a little more and squeeze a little more until I got these layers. And this picture actually informed this piece. I saw these two black doors just sitting there without any function, and it's like doors that lead nowhere. And I thought, what if I made a pair of doors that were made out of this living structure, which is the way that I see these tubes. So, and here you're gonna see a little bit about the process, because this is when I made them, and this is when they were raw. Then I fired them, I high fired them. So, and what I like about this clay is that some parts it turns brown, and sometimes it turns really black. And then here, for the ones that were interested in the process, this is how I fire it. So you have a layer of concrete board, and then another layer of shelves, and then you have a box. These two pieces are inside a very big clay box. And then I put bricks all around it just to protect if there's any glaze that is gonna seep out. And I also have fiber. And then I have more bricks. And then I have the pieces, and then I have more concrete board, and then I have all of this glaze that goes into it. So it really takes hours to load the kiln. But I have to do all of that because, or else sometimes the kiln could really get messy and bad. So really, you can see the result here. And you can still see parts of it. You can see parts of the clay and the concrete board. And I really like to leave those parts in the piece because I think it shows process, when process is important in labor.
So since you're talking technical, when you're firing like a giant box full of glaze,
It's like 4 days.
You just have to go super slow up and down?
Yeah, so the first 2 days are drying.
Yeah.
And then the third day is reaching temperature. No, it's like reaching, it's around cone 6. And then the last day I reach temperature and soak the kiln for a while. So before I used to fire in gas kilns, but now I've been firing in a Blau. And the Blau you can program, it's a Dutch kiln, and you can program the cooling. So I actually cool it down 100 degrees an hour. So the glaze doesn't really crack that much. And that's how I can get those sheets of glaze. So yeah, the Blau is it's a real revelation to be able to control the cooling of the kiln.
So Renata, while you're on it, you said process and labor
Yeah.
are connected. I mean, the firing is, in a sense,
Yeah, it's part of the
we call
process.
it heat work
Yeah.
often. Can you kind of draw more of a connection between that and your labor, your physical labor? Where do they other than the result of your work, how do they intersect?
I think they intersect, one, when I load the kiln, and how a lot of thought really goes into that, because a lot of that is going to show, it's going to be evident in the result, in what comes out, in a very physical and direct way, because you can find parts of what I used to prop the piece in the kiln in the piece. But also in labor, because I have to be there when the kiln fires. And that's in my mind, when the kiln fires, I have to be present all the time. I have to be present early in the morning, and all of the decisions about how to raise the temperature and how fast I should go. And also all of that thought that goes into how is the best way for this to be fired in order to achieve the best result. So there's a lot of mental labor during the firing as well. And I see the firing not only as just putting the piece in the kiln and letting it go, but as a collaboration. And we talked about this, I always thought that the piece became alive in the kiln. And it started moving, and it started doing things, and it sort of like breathes. It expands and contracts like as if it were living, and then you open the kiln and the piece is born. So I really saw it that way, but that connection of like giving birth to a piece, I thought about it, I just expressed it now. So I was gonna say I have never expressed it, but I just did, so there you go, the birth of that idea. And yeah, this repeating pattern of the interweaving tubes, it's like intestines, like something that is born out of a feeling, out of an emotion, out of your gut. So I call them beasts. I really started calling them beasts, and it's beasts that are born out of gut. And I made several iterations of them, and I wood fire them, which I thought were interesting results, but I'm not sold on that one. And here you can see the origin of thinking about these pieces. This is from the south of Mexico, and this is from the Renaissance. You've all seen this piece, probably this sculpture. So this interwoven, this connection, all of these things that I think, oh, I just thought about it, but no, actually you have seen it many times before. So there it is. And I think, to me, it's interesting to find this historical reference in something that I thought was very original. And these are the pieces that I told you I started in August. And I'm not going to show you a picture of the after because I am not done yet. But these, I bit the box for them, and then I poured the glaze. And now I am also experimenting with not only cutting them in the box shape, but now I'm sculpting them because I think what is the next step? They're not just boxes, they're not just this block thing. You have to give them something else. So now I'm sculpting with the saw and making different shapes out of them. So whenever I cut them, you can also see a section of the tube being open and the glaze going in. So there is a play of texture and color. And the pieces are very much influenced also by the colors that I see around. You can see that piece over there. And these pieces stayed in China. These are the pieces that I showed you from the previous picture, the ones in the table and the wheels in the middle of the room. And this piece was inspired by roadkill. Here you can see, I wanted to see, because I take a lot of pictures of roadkill, and this might be like a side gig of taking gory pictures of dead animals on the road. And I thought about all of this richness that is happening here, how I could do that, and how I could give it more like a cosmic, mysterious life. So I made this animal out of clay and then filled it up. And this one I actually didn't cut, I just broke, which is another way that I approach the work. Here you can see. Yes.
In this piece, in regard to the roadkill as well, are you celebrating the death of it, or are you celebrating the animal itself?
I think I'm celebrating the animal itself. I think I'm celebrating that when we see something dead like that, something so gory, our first attempt is to move away from it. But I like to observe it, and I like to see what used to be, and I like to see this interior coming out, just spilling out, which is not something that was intended, but it's something that happened. And I think that's a lot of what happens in our lives. We don't intend, it happens, and you look at it and you confront it, and you make work about it, and then you move on. So this is my last image. I've all spoken for almost an hour. And I want to finish this with this one. This is from the photographer Graciela Iturbide. I was born in Mexico, but I didn't tell you the exact location. I was born in Hermosillo, Sonora, which is in the border with San Diego. It's about 200 kilometers from the border, 3 hours car drive. And this is Comcac territory, or SETI, or as you know them in the US, the Autumn people, the desert people. When I was a child, my parents worked a lot, and Chayo, who was a SETI woman or Autumn woman from the desert, used to take care of me all the time, and she would take me to her home in the desert. And SETI people live from the desert. And just recently, I was reading a book by Jason De Leon, who works in the border. And this is a very nice quote that I'm gonna tell you now, because this is what Chayo showed me, how to live from the desert and how to not run from this very difficult place, but to embrace it. So he says, the perspiring and panting in the middle of the saguaro forest, they are part of the raw intimacy of the autumn people maintain with the desert. Somewhat ugly to the outside eye, this routine is an honest indicator of the strong bonds between the desert people and their surroundings. Instead of running away from the desert during its driest, hottest time, some still run to the heart of it. So I think that's what I do. I run to the heart of the unknown.
Wow. That's very moving.
Thank you.
Before we have a few questions, and I hope we do, because the neat thing about this is there's so many students in the audience, as well as their teachers. But I think especially for the students, you can learn so much from Renata, who's only a few years out of grad school, right?
Like two.
Two. Oh, only two.
I graduated in 2018.
You too. I thought it was 7. I'm getting that information.
Yeah, I'm about a year off.
Even closer. So, I mean, just personally, Renata, I want to thank you. That was so moving.
Thank you.
And I love the way you combine the monolithic, the elemental, and the contemporary in your own personal story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really great. So we have time for a few questions. So turn to the students first. Okay.
Regarding the forms that you use, do these like macaroni loops bear any? Do they bear any like relationship to like the circle forms?
Probably. As I said, I see them more as connecting and connecting transitions, connecting elements, and that's really what they are confusing for me. They are connecting. They are moving. They're trying to connect all of these elements, and I think some of them are more clear and more formally recognizable, and some of them end up being a real big mess, and it really depends on how clear I am that day. As I said, because I make and think at the same time, a lot of them respond to what is really happening that day. Some days I come with a very clear idea of what I'm going to do, and some days I don't, but still there.
They all have feet and platforms.
That started happening because I felt like they became very heavy in the bottom, and they couldn't really move by themselves that well. And going back to this idea that I just want to give them mobility to be able to leave whenever they want to.
Mm-hmm.
I just started giving them feet to leave.
I'm curious about how you decide how much of the firing process you want to show in your work. Because I understand you build these boxes and you cut them out. To what extent does something come out of the kiln and you go, oh, I don't want to see these stilts? And then do you make those decisions, or are you pretty much satisfied with the way it comes out of the kiln? And I'm just wondering how much of that firing process and the physical things that become a bit stuck in your pieces that you're okay to live with. And when you decide to refire it, it kind of adjusts it so it speaks more to your bases and your forms.
Sometimes I feel that my collaboration with the kiln is spot on, and the kiln gives me something, or something happens. I don't want to talk about it in those terms. The kiln gives me something, or something happens inside of it, and I feel this works. This is exactly what it needed. And sometimes I don't like it, and I cut it, and I don't want to say a swear word, but sometimes I fuck it up. I couldn't find a similar expression, but sometimes I fuck it up and I don't like it, and I have to redo it. And I feel my experience is that the second, the third, the fourth time I do something, it's better, because I learned more from it. There is a learning curve, and I learned, and now I know which mistakes I should repeat and which mistakes I should not. But yeah, there is a lot of change between when they come out from the kiln. They just don't come out and I think I'm ready. I think after the kiln, there is still 50% of the work to be done.
And that's such an interesting point, especially regarding what you were saying about the pieces that you're working on now that keep cracking.
Yeah.
And how there's also the time between when you first meet it again, and then like sort of getting to know it and sort of bouncing your own expectations against what the piece has become.
Yeah.
And kind of that's such an interesting dance and conversation that you have with the work.
Yes.
I mean, that I think everyone who works with fire has with the work.
Yeah, I think so. I think you open the kiln and sometimes it's great and many times it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So how's digital technology, i.e. the blow?
Oh, the blow.
How does that screw with that paying attention to the kiln? And you can program and leave it.
Well, so that's a new thing for me because I mean, I have to be honest, I find it very comfortable. I've only done 2 firings in the Blau. And one thing I have to say is that the Blau is such an expensive kiln that I am, for the first probably time, very much uncomfortable with making my work in it because if I do something to it, it's a very expensive mistake. But 2, there is, and yeah, this is where the pendulum goes to the comfortable side because it's like I can just program it and leave. And I don't have to take care of it. But then it takes that part of me really like, I don't know, babysitting this thing and like putting all of my thought into it. So I find that thing about being able to fire it down very, very useful. But it's also removing a part of my hand from it, I feel.
Any other questions?
No, a quick question about your photography on your pieces. How do you decide what side you want to show?
I take many pictures of it from all sides and look in the computer which one looks better.
Okay.
Many times the side.
That was straight to the point. You're right.
The side that I like the most might not be very photogenic.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Like, I mean, how do you decide what you want to show? I mean, other than like, oh, I see the pretty picture in that size.
In the picture, you mean?
Right. Well, I mean, how do you decide which angle that you want to see, that you want to show? Because I mean, if anything, I could take a picture of the one that Lucy's standing right next to, this taller one, and say, well, this looks like a great side, or I can turn around to your angle and say, oh, that looks like an even better side. But how do you specifically show?
That's hard because, as I said, the side that to me it's probably most interesting might not be the most photogenic one. And when you're taking pictures, you're not only taking them to show on social media or your website, but like I have to apply to a lot of grants to be able to make what I make, or to jobs or things like that. And sometimes you want to show the better picture that will describe the object for the person that is looking at the work. And as I said many times, it's not the side that I find that it's most important to me. But I also, and I was reading this very interesting thing about how we should allow for the viewer to also interpret the work, not give all the information to the viewer, but allow the viewer to interpret the work, because that is going to give us new avenues to see and to work. And I think that plays into it, because the side that I think really shows the intention in the work might not be what the viewer is getting from it. And I want to hear that too, because this is a two-way street, and you're going to tell me what you are seeing, and I'm going to learn from what you're seeing. I learned a lot. Like just yesterday, hearing people talk about pieces, a group of high schoolers came and saw it, and I was like, that's great. I never saw that, and that's a very fresh look, very not informed by all of this art speak. Mm-hmm. It was fresh. But talking about, going back to the photo question, I use the picture that works best, that describes the object the best. And that's hard, because ceramics you have to see in person.
Oh, absolutely.
And the photograph will never describe the object in full. Yeah.
Just in closing, say a few sentences about what you're doing in Fayetteville and who you're teaching and your work.
I am faculty and technician at the University of Arkansas. I teach grad students and undergraduates. Right now I'm teaching a seminar for graduate students, and a class that it's called Creative Thinking for undergraduates, which is a great class, because we just create stuff without worrying about the result. Yeah.
Okay. How's that?
Yeah.
Renata will be around for about 30 more minutes. I'm not quite sure. What time is it?
About, yeah,
What time is it?
20 minutes, 2:25. I have to take a plane at 5. So.
Our witching hour is 3 o'clock, but we'll pick up the chairs, we'll try to move the artwork back, and you can mingle and ask the questions.
Yeah.